Hi, this is the second part of video that I thought was going to be one, turned into two, about research designs, quantitative and qualitative. And so I want to talk a little bit about qualitative research. I was trained as a quantitative researcher, but when I really did a lot of research for about 30 years, what I found is that there were questions I couldn't answer from a quantitative perspective. I couldn't get to the information I was interested in because I didn't know enough about what was really happening. I didn't understand the phenomena. I didn't understand what was happening within the context of, for example, how parents and children might be interacting in a certain context. It's not a very good example, but Craswell has some very good examples in there. But I often was interested in wanting to understand how things were happening. And so this is a methodology that allows you to do that. It's a very different methodology. When done right, it is an extremely rigorous methodology. So people sometimes say, well, qualitative data is just messy and sloppy and it has no rigor to it, and that's true. Really, not at all true. Sometimes people say, "Well, qualitative data is easier than doing a quantitative study." I really disagree with that. I think that both types of, when you're doing either type of study and you're doing it rigorously, it is very difficult to do. They just are difficult in different ways. That's all there is to it. But they both have their places where it's really, really hard. So in qualitative studies, you often don't have a variable. You don't really understand things. And so you're trying to explore. You're trying to investigate. It's part of the reason that people like qualitative research in a constructivist approach, particularly in terms of a constructivist approach about trying to learn about children's learning, is because it follows that. It doesn't always. Some of them are done differently, but often in our field we use them as a way of trying to understand something that's going on that is very moving, that it flows, that it has that it kind of has an energy of its own, which makes it very hard to study in a quantitative perspective. So we use qualitative research quite a lot in early childhood work, particularly here. A qualitative study is needed to explore phenomena. So, for example, if you're trying to understand about distance learning, right? So we speak right now, distance learning. What can you learn about that through a qualitative methodology? You're often thinking about a central theme. So instead of a research question, sorry about that, you're actually doing a particular theme, a concept, a key concept or idea that you want to study. And that you want to explore because you need to know more about it. You need to understand it at a different kind of level. So you start with sort of a central concept. You go to a literature review but literature reviews are a little different, and Craswell talks a lot about this, that they are different in terms of what you do in a quantitative review. In a quantitative review, you're trying to figure out what the gap is, what the problem is that people have not been able to answer. In a qualitative one, you're just trying to understand how this study might fit in a larger context. But you're reviewing it just to sort of think about the research question and see where it might lead you, or what the central phenomena is. You use literature a lot more at the end when you're trying to see how what you have learned as compares to what other people have learned in the literature. So it's important, but it's not exactly the same kind of thing when you're doing a qualitative study. You're sort of looking at a different, you're using a different approach. And when you're doing a qualitative when you're doing a literature review of qualitative studies, you are actually trying to capture very different information than when you do a quantitative literature review, of quantitative studies. You're trying to capture different kind of things. You still have a purpose or research questions. We don't talk about the term hypothesis when you're talking about a qualitative study, but you are definitely looking at have a purpose and a research question, things you're trying to understand, a phenomena that you're trying to understand. What does it mean to be a professional? What does it mean to be a professional in a particular context. For example, in a school that is in a school that operates in a very in a community where there's lots of violence and that sort of stuff. What does it mean to be a professional in a school where the context is not middle class kind of context, and how does that change behavior and influence what you do? That might be a qualitative kind of question that you ask. Excuse me. In terms of data collection, it is very different because you are trying to learn from the participants in the study. You are not trying to guide what the participants tell you, but nonetheless you need protocols. Protocols for how you're going to record your data, and as part of your observations. You need protocols for general questions that you may be wanting to ask if in fact you are doing interviews to try to gather information from people. Some qualitative studies are totally observational. They're just watching a phenomena. They may be being part of a situation. In sociology, which is a field that's near and dear to my heart because I think it provides us so much of an understanding of the impacts of groups on other people. A lot of qualitative researchers in that field actually go and become part of groups to study and try to understand what they're doing. We don't tend to do that as much because, but we do sometimes when we're observing teachers and that sort of stuff. We're trying to be part of a group and understand some things that may be going on. But anyway, you need an interview protocol, and you need an observation protocol. What are you looking for? And more importantly than anything, probably, is how are you going to collect this information? Are you going to do audio tapes? Are you going to do audio and video tapes? Are you going to try to write down what you see? You have to be really careful about making a decision about this because we know that as soon as somebody or something enters into a context, it changes the behaviors of people. And that is a real concern in qualitative research. You don't want to the researcher does not want to influence the interactions, does not want to influence what is said, but we know that happens. So trying to figure out ways to be very unobtrusive, especially in observational research in a qualitative perspective, is extremely important and something that requires a lot of thought. But the other piece that everybody talks about in terms of qualitative studies that is so difficult is transcribing the audio recordings. So when you do audio or video, what are you going to do with the data and how are you going to process this? And this is where qualitative study can really become totally overwhelming in terms of the ability to do that. There are great softwares that can help you do that, but even with software, it's still you as the researcher have to understand and spend time with the data. It's not a matter of looking and saying, oh, did they raise their hand here? Oh, okay, I'm going to tally that. That's not how you do qualitative data. You're looking for themes. So you're reading and rereading or watching and rewatching a video to understand and see what you can see and see what seems to be the theme, the main idea, what's happening that you can that is related to your research questions. One of the really important things about most qualitative studies is that they have questions, they have things they're interested in learning about, and that guides the process, the data collection process and the data analysis process. It doesn't guide you to an answer, but it focuses what you're thinking about, and that can be very helpful in terms of not getting lost in qualitative data, which is fairly easy to do. And one of the phenomena that's really important in terms of helping to keep you from getting lost in the qualitative data is that you have to have people reading what your transcripts, for example, if you've got transcripts, or watching what you're watching, and totally independent of the researcher, seeing whether or not they're coming to the same conclusion. Do they see the same themes? Do they see the same things happening over and over again? So you spend a lot of time analyzing what Craswell calls text segments, and they can be sentences, excuse me, or a group of sentences, but you're looking for text segments that represent, that provide a picture or represent a theme or something that is part of your central question that you're trying to understand, that you're trying to get more information about. The reporting of qualitative research data is less structured, although there is a format that people use in terms of reporting your data. In qualitative data, you do a lot of, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes you do a lot of member checking, where the researcher comes up with what they think they have learned from the data or from an interview, particularly an interview, and they go back to the person they interviewed or to the person they observed and see whether or not that person feels like it captures what they think is going on, or how they were, what they felt like how they felt, or whether or not the researcher is off base. This is one of the places where bias can be really a big deal in qualitative data collection, and so you have to check it with the person who you actually interviewed. You need to have an independent person who is also looking at your data and seeing whether they're coming to the same conclusions or coming to different conclusions. The interpretation of data in qualitative studies is where the bias is biggest. And that's not to say there's not bias in quantitative, because there certainly is, but it is in that process that it's the biggest for this methodology. Again, I really like qualitative research. I think it tells us very important things. I have a colleague here who says you start off doing qualitative research in order to understand a phenomena, and then you move into some quantitative, you often, not always, but often move into more quantitative work to try to see whether or not the phenomena that you're watching or what you've learned about is actually generalizable beyond the 1 or 2 or 5 people that you've actually used in a qualitative study. I didn't mention this, but the qualitative studies often have much fewer, they're smaller size studies. They're not the studies of 50 or 60 people. They tend to be studies of 2 or 3 people, much smaller size, but the amount of data that you get can be just as large as in quantitative. It's just different types of data. Hope that's been helpful. Thanks. Does this work now? Probably not. Hi, this segment's going to talk just briefly about the differences between quantitative and qualitative data. As you're starting to think about how to read the 2 articles in the back of the Creswell chapter and change them, it's important that you really understand the difference in what those two types of methodology include, and what their basic differences is in terms of how they're focused. So quantitative research, the major characteristic of quantitative research is that you're describing a research problem through examining trends or the need for more data to explain a relationship between different types of variables. Variables like mother's interaction with their child and outcome being what kind of language development happens. So you're looking at the relationship between how moms interact with their child, and then you're looking at the relationship between that and what happens in terms of child's language development. A piece of a quantitative study is the literature review, and this review is done in such a way that it helps you think about what the research questions might be, what holes in the literature might there be, and so you come away from a literature review by posing a statement or a research question, or in quantitative studies we often talk about a hypothesis. We only use the term hypothesis really when we're talking about a study where we're comparing 2 different groups, and we're hypothesizing that one group who gets an intervention will have a different outcome than a group that does not get an intervention. But that's some terminology that's used around quantitative studies a lot. You are creating a purpose statement and research questions. The questions become pretty narrow and pretty focused. Like, for example, the one I just said was, what's the relationship between what happens to what happens in parent-child interaction that influences what kind of language development and ultimately kind of early literacy skills that a child may have. You want it to be measurable and observable. So somehow you need to have a data collection system that comes up with numbers at the end. Sometimes people do survey data as part of quantitative research, sometimes, which means simply giving somebody a piece of paper and asking their opinion about things. They're not always making a relationship between one and the other, but they just want to know what do teachers think about the support that they're getting around around challenging behaviors. So that could be a survey that someone does. But you also can observe behavior, observing children in classroom, collecting data on the number of words that they say in different contexts. For example, in a play area versus at a snack time. They're busy eating, they're probably not talking as much. Well, maybe some of them are. But you're collecting data, you have an observable measure. So also another example is we are often asking people about their attitudes about something and how that impacts on something else. So teachers' attitudes about children with disabilities may impact how they interact with those children in classrooms. So you may survey teachers, and then you may observe behavior in a classroom. And those would be two different measurements, two different things that you would measure, two different behaviors that you would try to capture, and then to examine how they look for each other. You're collecting numeric data, frequently from a large number of people, and often using instruments that are related to the questions that you're trying to ask. You can do a couple of things in terms of data analysis in a quantitative study. You can analyze people's responses to something, so that's kind of called a descriptive study. You can analyze trends, like if you're analyzing the trends of how fast a child learns a certain vocabulary concept, or vocabulary words, just using vocabulary words. How many vocabulary words what's the trend in terms of learning vocabulary as a result of a particular kind of intervention, or as the result of just simply development within a classroom? What's their vocabulary growth? We've looked a lot at vocabulary growth of children, very young children, who are living in poverty, and what does that look like? So those are trend kind of analysis. You can compare groups, like I said, groups who got intervention, groups who didn't get an intervention. You can also compare groups, for example, thinking about children who grow up in one environmental context and then children who grow up in another environmental context. It's not that we're manipulating an intervention in that case, it just means they are in different environments and you want to compare them and see what's happened. You are often, if you have a study where you have an hypothesis, a prediction, then you are discussing and doing an analysis to determine whether that prediction is right. And then it involves writing up a research report. And in quantitative study, research reports generally have a pretty fixed structure. They're in theory objective, and they often try to use an unbiased approach. I say that with a slight hesitation because there's a lot of ways that bias comes into quantitative studies, but and so it's not a purely number that it looks kind of more rigorous perhaps in qualitative studies. It has its own set of problems in terms of bias and what can happen that can contaminate the data. I was going to talk about both quantitative and qualitative. I think I'll just turn this one into a quantitative one, and I'll do a second segment around the qualitative. So that's a quick overview of what quantitative data is. One other thing I want to add is that not something that you will run into much in this course at all, but you should know about is that there is also something called single subject studies or single participant studies. These types of studies are a quantitative measure. They're very different than group studies, which is generally what we think about in quantitative research, but they're very important studies. It's a very important type of methodology, particularly if you are interested in kids with disabilities, because oftentimes you don't have large sample sizes with kids with disabilities, and so we use something called a single participant or single subject kind of type of study. And it can be very rigorous also, and it can be a very strong methodology. You're not going to learn about it in this class, but I do want to mention it. I hope that helps.